The first truck stopped so suddenly that the driver behind it nearly slammed into the tailgate. Then another pickup pulled onto the gravel shoulder. Within minutes, nearly a dozen farmers stood silently along the fence surrounding the smallest field in Cedar County. Nobody spoke. Nobody could explain what they were looking at. Nobody crossed the fence. They simply stared. Just beyond the weathered wire, Clara Whitmore's 10-acre field shimmered with deep green corn standing straight. Clean and healthy after 6 relentless weeks of rain. Across the road, hundreds of acres belonging to some of the county's wealthiest farmers sagged beneath yellow leaves, black fungal scars, and soil washed nearly bare by the endless storms. Someone finally whispered the question every farmer there was thinking. How can burnt ground grow like that? Wow! I told you she'd ruin that land. Those words had echoed across Clara Whitmore's fence the morning she lit the first slow fire. She ignored every warning. She ignored every joke. They called her reckless and foolish. Some even warned the sheriff she would burn half the county to the ground. When neighbors demanded to know why she was doing it, Clara gave the only answer she had. I just feel it's the right thing to do. That answer made people laugh even harder. Because following your heart doesn't usually change the future of a farm. Before we uncover how one forgotten discovery from the Amazon transformed the least respected field in Cedar County into the one everyone wanted to understand, take a moment to subscribe to Farm Route Chronicles and join us each week for another remarkable journey. Now let's go back to the spring of 1968. The smoke hadn't even cleared before the laughter began and everyone became certain Clara Whitmore had finally lost her mind. The spring of 1968 arrived slowly in Cedar County, Missouri. Morning mist drifted across the rolling hills long before the first pickup trucks rattled toward the grain elevator, and the smell of damp earth lingered in the cool air as farmers prepared for another planting season. For most families, spring followed a familiar rhythm. Repair the equipment. Turn the soil. Burn the leftover stubble. Plant. Pray for good weather. Clara Whitmore knew that rhythm as well as anyone. She had lived all 43 years of her life on the same modest 10-acre farm her late father had purchased after returning from the Second World War. It wasn't the biggest place in the county, and it certainly wasn't the richest, but every fence post, every oak tree, and every furrow carried a memory. Neighbors often joked that Clara knew each acre the way a mother knew her children. She laughed whenever she heard that. Secretly, she believed it was true. Every morning before sunrise, she walked her fields without carrying a shovel or notebook. She simply looked. She noticed where dew settled longest, where meadowlarks landed first, where earthworms surfaced after a gentle rain, where water lingered, where it disappeared. The land spoke quietly. Most people were simply too busy to hear it. That March morning, Clara stopped near the center of her field and crouched beside a patch of last year's corn stubble. She rubbed a handful of soil between her fingers. It felt tired. Not dead. Just tired. The ground crumbled into a pale dust despite the cool morning moisture. Years of ordinary farming had slowly changed its character. Each harvest had taken something away. Each season demanded a little more from the land than the season before. Clara couldn't explain why, but she suddenly found herself staring at the dry stalks scattered across the field. Most farmers would burn them quickly. A fast, hot fire. The smoke would rise. The ashes would scatter. By the following afternoon, planting preparations would begin. But something about that never sat right with her. She couldn't explain the feeling. Not with science. Not with experience. Only with instinct. What if we're letting it burn too fast? She whispered to herself. The words sounded strange even to her own ears. She stood quietly for another minute before walking back toward the farmhouse. Her older brother, Harold, was repairing a broken cultivator beside the barn. He looked up as Clara approached. You planning to torch that field tomorrow? He asked. Clara hesitated. I think I'm going to try something different. Harold leaned back against the tractor tire. Different usually costs money. I know. What kind of different? Clara glanced toward the field again. I don't want it to burn fast. Harold frowned. What do you mean? I want it to smolder. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Harold laughed, not to be cruel, but because he honestly believed she'd misspoken. You mean burn slower? She nodded. Why? Clara looked toward the field once more. I don't know. Harold folded his arms. You don't know? She smiled sheepishly. I just feel it's the right thing to do. He shook his head with an amused grin. That's the most Clara answer I've ever heard. Later that afternoon, word had already begun spreading across Cedar County. By supper time, 3 different neighbors had stopped by the fence with nearly identical questions. Harold says you're planning to babysit a fire. You trying to smoke out the whole county? You know that's not how anybody burns stubble. Clara answered every question politely. She never argued. Never raised her voice. Never claimed to know something others didn't. I just want to try. That answer frustrated people even more. Farmers respected experience. They respected research. They respected results. But they had very little patience for someone whose only explanation was a feeling. Within days, the story had reached the cafe on Main Street. Coffee cups paused halfway to weathered lips. Someone chuckled. Guess Clara's finally gone soft. Another farmer added. 10 acres isn't much. Still enough to ruin. The laughter rolled around the room. Outside, Clara loaded water barrels onto an old trailer, checked every shovel twice, and walked the edges of her field again. If she was going to follow her heart, she would do it carefully. She had no idea that one quiet decision was about to place her at the edge of a discovery that would leave an entire county questioning everything they thought they knew about healthy soil. The first ribbon of smoke rose just after sunrise. It wasn't the towering gray column most farmers expected when a stubble field was burned. Instead, it drifted lazily across Clara Whitmore's 10 acres, hugging the ground like morning fog. She stood quietly at the edge of the field with a long wooden rake in one hand and a shovel resting nearby. 2 50-gallon water barrels sat on a small trailer behind her old pickup. Every few yards along the field's edge, the grass had already been cleared down to bare earth, creating a firebreak wide enough to stop wandering flames. Clara had spent 3 full days preparing. Not because she expected the fire to get away from her. Because she refused to let it. She lit only a small corner of the field. The dry stalks caught slowly, producing glowing embers instead of racing flames. Whenever the fire tried to flare, she gently spread the burning stalks apart with her rake, forcing the flames to settle back into a slow smolder. Hour after hour, she walked beside the smoke. Patient. Careful. Watching every shift of the wind. From the county road, the scene looked almost ridiculous. Most farmers finished burning an entire field before breakfast. Clara seemed determined to spend the whole day tending a fire that barely looked alive. Before noon, the first pickup truck rolled to a stop beside her fence. It was Earl Benton. He climbed out, removed his cap, and stared across the smoking field. Morning, Clara. Morning, Earl. You planning on finishing before next winter? She smiled. I'll finish when it's ready. Earl chuckled. You know fire's supposed to work for you, not the other way around. Clara simply nodded. Maybe today we're working together. Earl laughed as he climbed back into his truck. I've heard a lot of strange things in my life. That might be the strangest. By lunchtime, more vehicles had gathered along the roadside. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they genuinely feared the slow-burning field might become a wildfire if the afternoon wind picked up. Not long afterward, another truck arrived. This one carried the emblem of the Cedar County Volunteer Fire Department. Fire Chief Leonard Hayes stepped out and walked toward Clara. He looked across the field before turning back to her. "We've had 3 calls this morning. I figured you might. You've got enough water?" Clara pointed toward the trailer. "And another tank behind the barn. Fire breaks?" She led him around the field's perimeter. Every edge had already been cleared. Loose brush had been removed. Tools were placed where they could be reached within seconds. Leonard studied the setup quietly. Finally, he smiled. "I wish everybody prepared this carefully. I don't like taking chances." "I can see that." He looked toward the glowing field once more. "I still don't understand why you're burning this way." Clara watched a curl of smoke disappear into the spring sky. "I don't fully understand it either. I just couldn't shake the feeling that the ground needed more time." Leonard nodded slowly. "I can't argue with being careful." Before leaving, he turned toward the small crowd gathered along the road. "She's doing everything safely. Nothing to worry about." A few people drove away. Others stayed. Mostly because they wanted to see this strange experiment fail. The smoke continued through the afternoon. It never roared. It whispered. As the stalks slowly broke down, black pieces of lightweight charcoal began appearing beneath the gray ash. Clara crouched and picked one up. It was surprisingly light. Tiny holes covered its surface like a sponge. She rubbed it gently between her fingers. Instead of crumbling into fine powder, it fractured into small black fragments. She slipped one into her shirt pocket without thinking. Something about it felt important, though she couldn't have explained why. As evening settled over Cedar County, the last wisps of smoke drifted into a sky painted orange and violet. The field looked unlike any burned field the neighbors had ever seen. Instead of pale gray ash scattered across bare dirt, much of the ground was dotted with countless pieces of black charcoal resting quietly on the surface. Across the fence, Earl slowed his truck one last time before heading home. He shook his head. "Tomorrow you'll be plowing that mess under." Clara looked across the darkened field. "No." Earl frowned. "No? I'm going to leave it there for a little while." He laughed loudly. "Now I know you've lost your mind." His truck disappeared down the gravel road. Clara remained standing alone beneath the fading light. The breeze carried the faint scent of wood smoke across the field. She looked over the blackened earth and smiled to herself. For the first time in weeks, the land no longer looked tired. It looked awake. Traditional post-harvest stubble burning was once common in many farming regions because it quickly cleared crop residue and made fields easier to prepare for planting. However, a fast, hot burn leaves relatively little stable charcoal behind. A slower, oxygen-limited smolder can produce far more charcoal, a carbon-rich material that persists in soil much longer. Decades later, scientists would study how similar charcoal-rich soils can improve soil structure, provide habitat for beneficial microorganisms, and help retain nutrients and moisture. Clara doesn't know this yet. She is simply following an instinct that will later prove remarkably close to real soil science. The smoke was gone by the next morning. Only silence remained. A thin blanket of gray ash stretched across Clara Whitmore's 10 acres, broken by thousands of small black pieces of charcoal that glistened in the early sunlight. Most farmers would have hitched a disc harrow behind the tractor and buried everything immediately. Clara didn't. She walked into the field carrying nothing but an old wooden bucket. She knelt, picked up one piece of charcoal, then another, then another. She rubbed each one gently between her palms before dropping it into the bucket. The brittle pieces cracked apart into smaller fragments. Not powder. Not dust. Tiny black chips. Hour after hour, she moved slowly across the field. It was exhausting work. By mid-morning, her hands were stained black. The lines in her palms disappeared beneath charcoal. Her knees ached from kneeling. Still, she kept going. Take a moment to like and subscribe to Farm Route Chronicles, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far this stories travel. Late that morning, Harold drove into the field with the old farmall tractor pulling a spring-tooth cultivator. He shut off the engine and climbed down. "You've been at this since sunrise." Clara nodded. "I want the charcoal smaller." Harold looked into the bucket. "You've got enough there." "Not yet. You know this isn't going to feed the corn." "No. So why keep doing it?" Clara smiled without looking up. "Because something tells me the soil wants every bit of it." Harold sighed. "You've always trusted your instincts. I've also been wrong before. So why risk your whole crop?" Clara looked across the field before answering. "Because doing the same thing every year hasn't made this land any stronger." Harold had no reply. Instead, he picked up another bucket. Without another word, he knelt beside his sister. By noon, the two of them worked side by side. Neither spoke much. The only sounds were birds singing across the fence rows and the quiet crackle of charcoal breaking beneath their fingers. Across the road, another pickup slowed. Then another. Soon, half a dozen farmers stood leaning against the fence. One finally called out, "You two planning to count every burnt stick?" The laughter spread quickly. Another shouted, "Maybe she's collecting charcoal for the barbecue." Even Harold laughed under his breath. Clara simply waved, then kept working. By late afternoon, the buckets were nearly full. Harold climbed back onto the tractor. "You ready?" She nodded. The cultivator moved slowly across the field. Instead of turning the soil deeply, its narrow shanks loosened only the upper few inches, gently mixing the charcoal fragments into the surface without burying them far below. Clara followed behind. Whenever she spotted larger pieces, she stopped to break them apart before the next pass. It looked painfully slow, painfully inefficient. One neighboring farmer shook his head. If she'd spent half this effort planting, she might actually harvest something. Another added, "She's farming ashes now." The nickname spread through Cedar County before sunset. Ash farmer. Some meant it as a joke. Others meant it as an insult. Clara never answered either one. As evening settled over the farm, she scooped up one last handful of the newly mixed soil. It looked completely different now. Instead of pale brown earth, tiny black fragments were scattered throughout the loosened topsoil. She squeezed it gently. To her surprise, the soil held together for a moment before breaking apart into soft, crumbly pieces. She frowned. It hadn't done that before. Most people would have ignored such a small difference. Clara didn't. She smiled quietly. "I think you're changing already." Harold overheard her. "You talking to the dirt again?" She laughed. "Maybe." He leaned on the tractor. "If anyone else heard you, they'd think you finally lost it." She looked over the blackened field glowing beneath the setting sun. "They already do." The siblings laughed together. Across the county road, however, another pair of eyes watched in silence. County Extension Agent Thomas Mercer had stopped on his way home. He had expected to see a ruined field. Instead, he saw something he couldn't quite explain. Not because the soil looked better. Because Clara was treating it as though she expected it to become something entirely different. He drove away without saying a word. But the image stayed with him long after the farm disappeared behind the hills. Something unusual was happening on those 10 acres. He simply couldn't yet decide whether it was remarkable or a remarkable mistake. One of the defining characteristics of charcoal used in soil is its stability. Unlike fresh plant material, which decomposes relatively quickly, charcoal can remain in the ground for decades or even centuries. When broken into small pieces and mixed into the upper soil, it creates tiny pores and surfaces that can eventually hold nutrients and beneficial microorganisms. 3 days later, the field was ready. At least, Clara believed it was. The black fragments that had once rested on the surface were now blended into the top few inches of soil. From a distance, her 10 acres looked darker than any other field in Cedar County. Not black, not brown. Something in between. Rich. Almost alive. The planting season had finally arrived. Across the county, the familiar sounds of spring echoed from sunrise until dusk. Tractors rumbled across open fields. Planters clicked steadily behind them. Freshly turned earth rolled into neat rows that stretched toward every horizon. It was the sound of another growing season beginning. Harold climbed onto the old farmall and looked toward Clara. "You still planting the same corn?" She nodded. "The very same seed. No special fertilizer?" "No." "No different planting depth?" "The same as always." Harold smiled. "Well, if this works, nobody can say it was the seed." Clara laughed. "I suppose they can't." The old planter rolled forward. One careful row at a time. The seeds disappeared beneath the dark soil. Every few feet, Clara stopped to scoop up another handful of earth. It felt different. Cooler. Softer. When she squeezed it gently, it held together just long enough before falling apart into small, crumbly pieces. Again. She couldn't explain why. She only knew the field felt healthier than it had a week earlier. Across the road, Earl Benton watched from the seat of his pickup. He climbed the fence and walked over. "You finally decided to plant." "I did." He knelt and picked up a handful of Clara's soil. His eyebrows rose. "Looks like you've dumped half your fireplace into this field." "It does." "You really think burnt stalks are going to feed corn?" "I honestly don't know." Earl brushed the soil from his hands. "I've farmed 30 years. My father farmed before me. My grandfather before him. And none of them ever planted into a field that looked like this." Clara smiled kindly. "Then maybe one of us will learn something." Earl laughed. "Or one of us will lose a crop." By the following week, tiny green shoots began pushing through the soil across Cedar County. One field after another slowly turned green. Clara's field emerged too. Nothing remarkable. Nothing magical. Just neat rows of young corn reaching toward the spring sunshine. The neighbors couldn't help but notice. It sprouted. So far. Give it time. Most assumed the charcoal would eventually rob the soil of nutrients. Others believed the roots would struggle in the strange mixture. A few quietly predicted the crop would fail before summer. But Clara never argued. She simply continued walking her field every morning. Sometimes she carried a small hoe. Sometimes nothing at all. She watched. She listened. She learned. Nearly every day, she noticed something small. After a light rain, puddles lingered across neighboring fields. Her field drained sooner. When the afternoon sun dried the surface, the soil beneath remained cool to the touch. Earthworms seemed easier to find. Even the smell was different. The earth carried a rich, almost sweet scent she hadn't noticed before. She never mentioned it. Not yet. Because she wasn't sure anyone would believe her. One afternoon, County Extension Agent Thomas Mercer pulled into the farmyard. He stepped from his truck carrying a clipboard. "I hope you don't mind a visit." "Not at all." They walked slowly through the young corn. Thomas knelt every few yards, studying the soil without saying much. Finally, he stood. "I've heard every version of this story imaginable." Clara smiled. "I'm afraid I can't help with the rumors. I'd rather hear the truth." She looked across the field. "I burned slower. I kept the charcoal. I mixed it into the topsoil." "And why?" Clara hesitated. "I wish I had a better answer. I simply felt the land needed something we kept letting disappear." Thomas looked at her for several seconds. Most people expected practical answers from farmers. Experience. Numbers. Methods. Clara offered none of those. Clara waited. I've never seen anyone try this. Neither have I, Thomas smiled. I'll be back. As his truck disappeared down the gravel road, Clara returned to her slow walk between the rows. The young corn rustled gently in the afternoon breeze. It looked no taller than anyone else's. No greener. No stronger. If there was a difference, it was still hidden beneath the ground. And sometimes, the most important changes are the ones no one can see. The first few weeks after planting rarely reveal what's happening beneath the surface. During this stage, a corn plant invests much of its energy in developing roots. Healthy soil structure allows roots to grow more easily, reach oxygen, and access water and nutrients. Charcoal-rich soil doesn't act like a traditional fertilizer. It contributes very little plant nutrition on its own. Instead, its greatest value comes from improving the soil's physical structure. Its tiny pores can help retain moisture, reduce nutrient loss, and provide protected spaces where beneficial soil microorganisms can thrive. These changes are subtle at first. A farmer walking through the field may not notice them above ground, but the roots often do. By the middle of May, something changed. It began with a gentle rain that everyone welcomed. After 2 dry springs, nobody in Cedar County complained about a little extra moisture. The first shower lasted an afternoon. The second stretched through the night. The third arrived before the fields had time to dry. Within a week, the gravel roads had turned soft beneath truck tires. The creeks climbed their banks. Fence posts stood in shallow pools of muddy water. Still, most farmers remained optimistic. Corn likes rain. That phrase echoed through cafes, feed stores, and church parking lots across the county. At first, they were right. The young plants grew quickly beneath the cloudy skies. The county looked greener than it had in years. But the rain didn't stop. Another week passed. Then another. Storm after storm swept across northern Missouri. Heavy clouds rolled over Cedar County almost every afternoon. Thunder became part of everyday life. The fields never had a chance to breathe. One morning, Harold stood on the porch watching another curtain of rain sweep across the hills. I've never seen it stay this wet. Clara quietly poured 2 cups of coffee. It'll pass. You hope. I do. Harold looked toward the fields. The grounds had enough. Across the county, farmers began noticing small changes. Low spots filled with standing water. Tractor ruts refused to dry. The soil became sticky and heavy beneath every boot. In some fields, the young corn lost its bright green color. The leaves faded slightly. Not enough to alarm anyone. Just enough to raise questions. County Extension Agent Thomas Mercer spent nearly every day driving from one farm to another. Everywhere he stopped, he heard the same concerns. My fertilizers should have carried longer. The roots aren't growing. The plants just seem tired. Thomas took notes, collected soil samples, measured rainfall. Yet every answer seemed to lead to another question. Late one afternoon, he decided to stop by Clara Whitmore's farm once again. He expected to find the same problems. Instead, he frowned. The corn looked normal, not taller, not dramatically greener, simply healthy. He climbed from the truck and knelt between the rows. His fingers sank into the soil. It was moist, but not sticky. He squeezed a handful. It held together briefly before crumbling apart with surprising ease. He stood silently, then walked across the road into Earl Benton's neighboring field. His boots immediately sank several inches into the mud. The soil clung to his soles like wet clay. When he picked up a handful, it formed a heavy lump that refused to break apart. Thomas looked back toward Clara's farm. 2 neighboring fields. The same rain. The same soil type. The same planting season. Yet they felt completely different beneath his hands. He crossed back to Clara. Have you noticed anything unusual? She thought for a moment. Only little things. Like what? The puddles disappear sooner. Thomas nodded. I noticed. The ground doesn't feel as hard after the rain. I noticed that too. She looked toward the young corn. The roots seem happier. Thomas smiled slightly. You can't actually see the roots. No. But sometimes you can see what healthy roots do. That answer stayed with him. Because despite all his years studying agriculture, he couldn't argue with it. That evening, the rain returned once again. The drops tapped steadily against the farmhouse windows. Clara stood on the porch watching water fall across her field. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't expecting miracles. She simply hoped the land she had trusted would now return the favor. Far across Cedar County, most farmers prayed for sunshine. Clara did too. But unlike everyone else, she no longer feared what was happening beneath the surface. Because for the first time in years, she believed her soil was ready for whatever came next. She had no idea. The hardest weeks of the season were still ahead. By the first week of June, the rain had become a burden no one wanted to carry. Nearly every conversation in Cedar County began the same way. Did you get any sunshine yesterday? No. You? Not enough. The clouds had settled over the county like an unwelcome guest. Fields that had looked promising only weeks earlier were beginning to tell a different story. The first signs were subtle. Corn leaves lost their deep green color. The lower leaves turned pale. Some curled inward despite the abundance of water. Others developed small brown lesions that spread after every damp night. At first, farmers blamed the weather. Then they blamed the seed. Some blamed the fertilizer. Everyone had an explanation. No one had an answer. One morning, Earl Benton walked into his west field before sunrise. His boots disappeared into the saturated ground with every step. He knelt beside a young corn plant and gently pulled. The roots barely resisted. The soil surrounding them smelled sour. Not rotten, but starved of fresh air. Earl frowned. He broke open a clump of mud in his hand. It smeared across his fingers like wet clay. The earth seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. Across the fence, Clara was already walking her morning rounds. She paused beside one of her own corn plants. The leaves glistened with rain, but they stood upright. She pressed her boot into the soil. It yielded softly before supporting her weight. She knelt and gently brushed away the surface around one plant. Fine white roots stretched confidently through the dark soil. She carefully covered them again. "Keep growing," she whispered. Later that afternoon, County Extension Agent Thomas Mercer returned with a small shovel and several paper sample bags. "I hope you don't mind." Clara smiled. "You've already worn a path to my field." Thomas laughed. "I've been thinking about this place all week." Together they dug 2 shallow soil pits. One in Clara's field. One in Earl Benton's. The difference surprised even Thomas. Clara's soil broke apart into loose, rounded crumbs. Tiny channels ran through it where earthworms had been working. Water had soaked downward instead of remaining trapped near the surface. Just across the road, Earl's soil came out in heavy blocks. Dense. Sticky. Almost shiny where it had been compressed by weeks of rain. Thomas stared at the 2 samples lying side by side. Same county. Same weather. Similar soils. Yet they behaved as though they belonged to different worlds. Word spread quickly. Before long, several neighboring farmers gathered beside Clara's fence once again. Only this time, no one laughed. Instead, they watched Thomas carefully compare the soil. One farmer finally spoke. "Is she using some new fertilizer?" Thomas shook his head. "Not that I've found." "Different seed?" "The same variety everyone else planted." Someone else crossed his arms. "Then what's making the difference?" Thomas looked across Clara's field. I don't know. It was the first time anyone in Cedar County had ever heard their extension agent admit those words. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain. A few days later, the county received another storm. Sheets of rain hammered the fields through the night. Lightning flashed across the hills. Water rushed through roadside ditches already overflowing from weeks of storms. By sunrise, parts of Cedar County looked more like marshland than farmland. Harold climbed into his truck and drove toward Clara's field. He stopped halfway down the road. Several neighbors were already there. Nobody spoke. They simply stared. Water still covered portions of nearby farms. Yet Clara's field had already begun draining. Small puddles remained in a few low places, but most of the ground was firm enough to walk across. The corn stood tall, its leaves catching the first rays of morning sunlight breaking through the clouds. Across the road, large sections of neighboring fields remained waterlogged. Yellow patches spread across the rows. Some plants had already begun collapsing. Earl removed his cap. I've farmed this land for 30 years. And I've never seen anything like this. Clara looked across both fields. She felt no pride, only gratitude. Because deep inside, she knew she hadn't defeated the weather. The weather was simply revealing something that had been hidden beneath the soil all along. Take a moment to like and subscribe to Farm Route Chronicles, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far this stories travel. That evening, Thomas Mercer sat alone in his office. The 2 soil samples still rested on his desk. He picked up Clara's sample once more. Dark, crumbly, light in his hand. Tiny black fragments caught the light from his desk lamp. He turned one of them between his fingers. Charcoal. Just charcoal. Or was it? He opened a filing cabinet and began searching through old university bulletins. Then agricultural journals. Then conference papers. Hours passed. Nothing explained what he had witnessed. Just as he was about to give up, a folded newsletter from the University of Missouri slipped from an old folder. Inside was a brief reference to unusual charcoal-rich soils being studied by archaeologists in South America. Only 2 sentences. No detailed explanation. No farming recommendations. Just a passing mention. Thomas read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. He leaned back slowly. For the first time, he wondered if Clara's field wasn't an accident. Perhaps. It was a question that science itself had only just begun asking. And somewhere beyond Missouri, someone might already be searching for the answer. One of the greatest benefits of healthy soil is aggregation, the formation of stable, crumb-like structures created by minerals, organic matter, fungal networks, and soil organisms. Well-aggregated soil contains spaces of many sizes. Larger pores allow excess rainwater to drain and oxygen to return after storms, while smaller pores retain moisture for plants between rains. By the second week of June, people stopped driving past Clara Whitmore's farm. They started stopping. It began with 1 pickup, then 3, then half a dozen. Before long, the narrow gravel road beside her 10-acre field looked busier than Main Street on Saturday morning. Word had traveled farther than anyone expected. Not because Clara's corn was the tallest. Not because it was producing record yields. But because it was the only field that seemed untouched by the problems spreading across Cedar County. The questions had changed. Weeks earlier, people had laughed. Now, they wanted answers. One warm morning, Clara found 3 unfamiliar trucks parked outside her gate. The men climbing out weren't local. Their boots were too clean. Their shirts carried embroidered company names from grain elevators nearly 50 miles away. One introduced himself. "Name's Walter Briggs. We've been hearing stories." Clara smiled politely. "I imagine you've heard several versions." Walter chuckled. "That's usually how farming stories travel. He looked across the field. "I'd like to walk it." "You're welcome to." The three men moved slowly between the rows. Every few yards they stopped. They examined leaves, measured stalks, dug small handfuls of soil with pocket knives. One finally stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "I don't see anything unusual." Walter looked toward Clara. "That's exactly what's unusual." By afternoon, County Extension Agent Thomas Mercer returned. This time he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Dr. Samuel Harris, a soil scientist from the University of Missouri. Thomas had spent nearly a week convincing him the trip was worthwhile. Dr. Harris wasn't expecting much. He had seen countless farming miracles. Most turned out to be misunderstandings. As he climbed over the fence, he looked around quietly. "So this is the famous field." Thomas nodded. "This is the one." Dr. Harris knelt almost immediately. He wasn't looking at the corn. He was looking at the ground. He picked up a handful of soil, rubbed it gently between his fingers, then reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small folding magnifier. Clara watched silently. He studied the tiny black fragments mixed throughout the earth. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for Thomas to notice. "You've seen this before?" Dr. Harris didn't answer immediately. "I've seen photographs." "Photographs?" "Never a field." He continued studying the soil. "This is unexpected." The small crowd gathering along the roadside grew larger by the hour. Some came carrying lawn chairs. Others leaned against their trucks. Even children rode bicycles to the fence after hearing there was something unusual happening at Clara Whitmore's farm. By sunset, nearly 30 people lined the roadside. Nobody laughed. Nobody mocked. They simply watched. For the first time, Clara's field had become the most talked about place in Cedar County. Dr. Harris walked slowly across the entire 10 acres before finally stopping beside Clara. "I'd like to ask you something." "Of course." "When did you decide to do this?" "This spring." "Why?" Clara smiled awkwardly. "I suppose that's the question everyone keeps asking." "And your answer?" "I felt the land needed something we kept burning away." Dr. Harris remained silent. "You read that somewhere?" "No." "Someone teach you?" "No." "You've never heard of charcoal-rich soils?" She shook her head. "I've never heard the term." Thomas looked confused. If she didn't learn it, how did she know? Dr. Harris looked across the field once more. Sometimes observation arrives before explanation. As evening settled over the farm, the scientist crouched one final time. He gently brushed away the surface soil. Hundreds of tiny charcoal fragments lay scattered through the dark earth. He picked up one piece no larger than a fingernail. Holding it toward the fading sunlight, he smiled quietly. "This shouldn't be here." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean." He turned the charcoal over carefully. "The last time I saw research describing soil like this, it wasn't from Missouri. It wasn't even from North America." Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. "Where was it from?" Dr. Harris slipped the charcoal into his palm once more. "The Amazon." The crowd, standing only a few yards away, couldn't hear the conversation. But Clara did. She looked at him, puzzled. "The Amazon?" Dr. Harris nodded. "Thousands of miles from here. Ancient people there created unusually dark soils unlike anything surrounding them. They've puzzled scientists for years." Thomas stared at the ground beneath his boots. "You think this is the same thing?" Dr. Harris shook his head carefully. "No. Not the same. But." He looked back across Clara's field. "It may be following the same idea." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The evening breeze rustled softly through the young corn. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled again. And standing in the middle of a quiet Missouri farm, A handful of ordinary charcoal had just connected Cedar County to one of the greatest agricultural mysteries on Earth. By the 1960s, archaeologists had already recognized that parts of the Amazon basin contained unusual areas of extremely dark, fertile soil surrounded by naturally less fertile tropical soils. These soils would later become widely known as terra preta, meaning black earth in Portuguese. Researchers noticed that these ancient soils contained unusually high amounts of stable charcoal mixed with organic materials such as food scraps, animal bones, and pottery fragments. Unlike ordinary tropical soils, they remained fertile for centuries. Although scientific understanding was still developing in the late 1960s, these discoveries suggested that people, not nature alone, had created these remarkably productive soils. This challenged long-held assumptions about how soil fertility could be built and sustained. Clara has not recreated terra preta. Rather, through careful observation and intuition, she has stumbled onto a principle that resembles one small part of what scientists were only beginning to understand, that stable charcoal can become an enduring component of healthy soil. For the next several days, Dr. Samuel Harris couldn't stop thinking about Clara Whitmore's field. He had examined soils across Missouri for nearly 20 years. Flooded bottomlands, wind-blown prairie, heavy clay, rich loam, thin hillside ground. Every farm had its own story. Yet none had resembled the 10 acres in Cedar County. Not because the soil was perfect. Because it reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. 3 days later, Thomas Mercer found Dr. Harris sitting alone in his university office. Books covered nearly every inch of the desk. Open journals lay stacked across the floor. Old conference notes rested beside weathered field maps. "You've been here all night." Dr. Harris smiled without looking up. "I believe I have." "Find anything?" "Not enough." He reached beneath a stack of papers and pulled out a thick hardcover book. Its dark green cover showed years of use. The title had nearly faded. Amazon Soils. Thomas frowned. "What's that?" "A book written by a Dutch soil scientist. It came out only a couple of years ago. I bought it because I was curious. And I never imagined I'd need it in Missouri." He carefully opened the book. Several pages had been marked with folded corners years before. He stopped at one illustration. Black and white photographs showed unusually dark patches of soil surrounded by much lighter earth deep within the Amazon basin. Thomas leaned closer. "It looks almost like Clara's." Dr. Harris nodded. "That caught my attention." He turned another page. The author describes ancient communities creating remarkably dark soils by gradually adding charcoal along with organic materials over many generations. Thomas read silently for a moment. They weren't trying to burn the land. No. They were building it. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Thomas looked up. "But Clara has never seen this book." "I believe her." "Then how?" Dr. Harris closed the cover gently. "Science doesn't invent nature. It discovers it." He looked out the office window. Sometimes two people, separated by thousands of miles, arrive at similar ideas simply because they both pay attention to the land beneath their feet. The following morning, the two men returned to Cedar County. This time, Dr. Harris carried the book. Clara welcomed them into her farmhouse kitchen. Fresh coffee filled the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows once again. Dr. Harris placed the heavy volume on the table. "I brought something I'd like to show you." Clara looked at the unfamiliar cover. "I've never heard of it." "I didn't expect you had." He opened to the photographs. She stared silently. The dark soils looked strangely familiar. Not identical, but familiar enough to make her pause. "They look like pieces of my field." Dr. Harris smiled. "I thought you might notice." He explained that archaeologists had found unusually fertile dark soils scattered across parts of the Amazon. Nobody fully understood them yet. Scientists believed ancient people had somehow transformed poor tropical soils into land that remained productive for centuries. Clara listened without interrupting. Finally, she asked the question that had been quietly growing in her mind. So, did I accidentally make the same soil? Dr. Harris shook his head gently. No. What you created is your own field. Your own soil. But the charcoal you've added may be working through some of the same natural principles. Thomas leaned forward. What principles? Dr. Harris reached into his pocket. He placed two objects on the kitchen table. One was an ordinary pebble. The other was a small piece of charcoal from Clara's field. Imagine a heavy rain. He poured a little water from Clara's pitcher across both. The water slipped quickly off the smooth stone. Then it soaked slowly into the tiny pores of the charcoal. Clara watched carefully. It holds the water. Some of it. And nutrients can behave similarly. He handed Clara the charcoal. Look closely. She held it toward the window. Hundreds of tiny openings covered its surface. It looks like a sponge. In many ways. That's exactly why scientists find it interesting. For the next hour, the three of them talked about soil. Not as dirt, but as something alive. Dr. Harris explained that healthy soil was filled with invisible organisms. Bacteria, fungi, earthworms, countless forms of microscopic life working together every day. The healthier those living communities become, the healthier the soil becomes. Clara smiled quietly. So all this time, I wasn't only feeding the corn. Dr. Harris nodded. You may have been helping the soil itself. She looked toward the rain-covered field outside the kitchen window. Her father used to say, if you take care of the land remembers. She had always believed those words were poetic. Now, for the first time, they sounded remarkably close to science. As Thomas prepared to leave, he glanced once more at the old green book resting on Clara's kitchen table. Just 2 years earlier, few people in America had even heard of it. Now, one quiet farmer in Cedar County had unknowingly given its ideas a living demonstration. Outside, the clouds finally began to break. For the first time in weeks, sunlight spilled across Clara Whitmore's 10 acres. And beneath that warming light, millions of unseen organisms continued the patient work that no one, not even Clara, could see. Yet, by late August, the rain had finally stopped. Summer sunshine returned to Cedar County, drying the roads, warming the fields, and giving every remaining crop one last chance to mature. Some farms recovered. Many never fully did. Across the county, yellow patches remained scattered through fields that should have been a deep, confident green. The damage from weeks of saturated soil had quietly followed the corn into harvest season. Clara noticed it every time she drove into town. Fields looked uneven. Some stalks stood tall. Others barely carried a full ear. No one needed the county yield reports to know it had been a difficult year. The land had already told them. One crisp September morning, the sound of combines echoed across Cedar County. Harvest had begun. Golden dust drifted into the cool morning air as machine after machine rolled through the fields. Clara owned no combine of her own. Like many smaller farmers, she hired a local custom harvester each season. When the machine finally pulled into her driveway, the driver climbed down wearing a puzzled smile. I've been hearing about this field all summer. Clara smiled. I suppose now you'll see it. I hope it lives up to the stories. The combine entered the first rows just after sunrise. Several neighbors gathered once again along the fence. Some leaned against pickup trucks. Others stood quietly with folded arms. Nobody came to laugh this time. They came to learn. The machine moved steadily through the dark green rows. Its engine hummed with the steady rhythm every farmer knew by heart. Then, The grain tank began filling. The driver glanced at the yield monitor. He frowned, looked again, then slowed the machine. Something wasn't right. He climbed down, walked back toward Clara. "You mind if I check something?" "Go ahead." He reached into the grain tank and scooped up a handful of freshly harvested corn. The kernels were full, bright, uniform. He smiled, then looked back toward the monitor. "I think it's working." "What is?" "The monitor." "You don't sound convinced." He laughed. "I wasn't expecting numbers like these." Within an hour, word spread faster than it had all spring. People began arriving before the first truckload even left the field. The grain elevator manager came. The county banker. Farmers from neighboring townships. Even reporters from the local newspaper. Everyone asked the same question. "How much is it yielding?" Clara answered honestly. "We're still measuring." She refused to guess. The land deserved better than guesses. By late afternoon, the final calculations were complete. Thomas Mercer stood beside the combine holding a small notebook. He looked toward the crowd. This field didn't set a county record. Several people nodded quietly. Then Thomas smiled. But that's not the remarkable part. He turned another page. Considering the rainfall this season, Clara's field outperformed nearly every comparable field in this part of the county. A murmur spread through the crowd. Thomas continued. "It wasn't the highest yield we've ever recorded. It was the smallest loss." The words settled over the gathering. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Earl Benton slowly removed his cap. He walked toward Clara. She remembered the laughter, the jokes, the warnings, the nickname, Ash Farmer. Earl stopped only a few feet away. "I owe you an apology." Clara looked at him kindly. "You don't owe me anything." I laughed. "I know. I told everyone you'd ruined your land." "I remember." He looked across the harvested field. "I've never been happier to be wrong." Clara smiled. "We all learn." So did I. One by one, the other farmers crossed the fence. Not to criticize. Not to inspect. To ask. "How slow did you let the fire burn? How deep did you mix the charcoal? What would you do differently?" For nearly 2 hours, Clara answered every question. She never exaggerated. Never claimed certainty. Whenever she didn't know an answer, she simply said, "I don't know. I only know what happened here." Dr. Harris watched quietly from the edge of the crowd. Finally, he stepped forward. "I hope all of you remember something." Every conversation stopped. What Clara discovered wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. And it certainly wasn't luck. He picked up a handful of soil from the edge of the harvested field. This is the result of paying attention. He let the soil fall slowly through his fingers. For generations we've thought of soil as something crops grow in. But healthy soil is an ecosystem. It breathes. It stores water. It feeds life beneath the surface. And when we care for that living system, it often cares for us in return. The crowd remained silent. Not because they disagreed. Because they were thinking. As the sun settled behind the Missouri hills, the last truckload of grain rolled away from Clara's farm. She stood alone in the harvested field. The blackened soil she had trusted months earlier was now scattered with fresh corn stubble once again. She bent down, picked up a small piece of charcoal that still remained from the spring burn. It hadn't disappeared. It was still there, quietly doing its work. She smiled. Not because she had proven everyone wrong, but because the land had reminded everyone that the greatest changes often happen where no one thinks to look. One of the most important lessons from modern soil science is that resilience is often more valuable than maximum production. Harvest ended. But the conversations had only begun. For weeks afterward, Trucks continued pulling into Clara Whitmore's driveway. Some visitors came from neighboring counties. Others drove from nearly 100 miles away. A few simply wanted to shake her hand. Most came carrying notebooks. Every one of them wanted to know the same thing. What exactly did you do? Clara always answered the same way. I'll show you. One cool October morning, nearly 20 farmers gathered beside her field. Some had laughed at her in the spring. Now they stood quietly, waiting. There was no stage. No microphone. No grand speech. Only a woman in worn work boots standing on the same ground everyone once believed she had ruined. Clara bent down and picked up a handful of soil. This is where everything starts. She let the dark earth run slowly through her fingers. I used to think soil was something you planted into. She smiled. Now I think it's something you take care of. The group remained silent. Not because they were skeptical. Because they were listening. Dr. Samuel Harris stepped beside her carrying two shallow wooden trays. One held dense clay taken from a nearby struggling field. The other contained soil from Clara's farm. Without saying a word, he poured the same amount of water into both trays. The first tray quickly became slick. Water pooled across the surface before slowly running over the edge. The second absorbed the water gradually. Some soaked in. Some remained between the small crumb-like spaces. The soil held together without sealing itself shut. Several farmers leaned closer. You can actually see the difference. Dr. Harris nodded. Soil isn't just made of particles. It's made of spaces. He pointed toward Clara's sample. Those spaces allow air, water, roots, fungi, earthworms, and countless microscopic organisms to live together. He gently picked up another charcoal fragment. These tiny pieces don't feed the crop directly. They help build a better home for the life already living beneath our feet. Earl Benton slowly raised his hand. So, I've been thinking about my soil the wrong way. Dr. Harris smiled. Not wrong. Just incomplete. For many years, agriculture focused on feeding plants. Today, we're beginning to understand we must also feed the soil. Several farmers nodded thoughtfully. One older rancher quietly whispered, "My father used to say, healthy dirt smells alive." Clara smiled. He was closer to the truth than he probably realized. Thomas Mercer knelt beside a freshly dug soil pit. He gently lifted a handful of dark earth. Tiny roots wove through the crumbly structure. Earthworms disappeared deeper into the ground as sunlight reached them. "This is what surprised me most," he said. The crop wasn't simply healthier. The soil itself had changed. Dr. Harris agreed. When soil biology improves, the effects often continue long after one growing season. He looked across the harvested field. Think of healthy soil as a community. No single organism can do every job. But together, they recycle nutrients, build soil structure, help roots explore deeper, and make the entire system more resilient. One younger farmer stepped forward. "Does that mean every one of us should start burning fields slowly?" Dr. Harris answered before Clara could. "No." The crowd looked surprised. He continued. "Never copy a practice simply because it worked once. Every farm is different. Every soil is different. Every climate is different. The lesson isn't to imitate Clara. It's to understand why her field behaved differently." He held up the charcoal fragment once more. "This is one tool. Not the whole toolbox. The real goal is healthier soil." Clara looked around the group. "I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong. I came because I was worried." She paused. "My father always believed the land remembered how we treated it. When I looked across this field last spring, it looked tired. I couldn't explain it. I just couldn't ignore it." She smiled softly. "Turns out, the soil had been trying to tell me something." For several moments, nobody spoke. The autumn wind carried dry corn leaves across the field. Somewhere nearby, a flock of blackbirds lifted into the sky. One by one, the farmers bent down, not to inspect Clara's field, but to touch the soil themselves. Some rubbed it between their fingers. Others smelled it. A few simply held it quietly in their hands. For perhaps the first time in their farming lives, they weren't looking at dirt. They were looking at a living world, one that had been beneath them. Every single day, as the gathering ended, Dr. Harris handed Clara the old copy of Amazon Soils. "I think this belongs with you for a while." She looked surprised. "I couldn't. I insist. You've earned it." She accepted the book carefully. Not because it explained everything, but because it reminded her of something important. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries don't begin inside laboratories. They begin with someone willing to notice what everyone else walks past. Winter arrived quietly in Cedar County. The combines were gone. The grain trucks had stopped rolling. Fields that had buzzed with machinery only weeks before now rested beneath a thin layer of frost. From the road, Clara Whitmore's 10 acres looked no different from anyone else's. The corn was gone. The stalks had been cut. The land appeared asleep. But beneath the surface, life continued. Earthworms tunneled through the dark soil. Fungi stretched delicate threads between tiny soil particles. Billions of microorganisms carried on their silent work, unseen by everyone driving past. The field had entered another season. The soil had not. One cold December morning, Clara stood outside her barn stacking firewood when a familiar pickup turned into the lane. It was Earl Benton. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him came 4 more trucks. Then another. By the time Clara reached the gate, nearly a dozen neighboring farmers had gathered in her yard. Each truck carried something unusual. Barrels, old steel drums, bundles of dry corn stalks, pruning wood, tree limbs collected after autumn storms. Clara looked from one truck to another, then back at Earl. "What on earth is all this?" Earl smiled. "We came to ask a favor." "What kind of favor?" He scratched the back of his neck. "We'd like you to show us how to build one of those slow fires." Clara laughed softly. "I thought you'd all decided I'd lost my mind." Another farmer grinned. "We did." A ripple of laughter spread through the group. Then Earl's expression turned serious. "But this year's harvest taught us something. We've spent years trying to grow better crops. Maybe it's time we started growing better soil." For the rest of the morning, Clara walked with the group around her field. She didn't stand in front of them. She walked beside them. She showed them how she cleared wide fire breaks, why she always watched the weather forecast, how she kept water close at hand, why she never left a fire unattended. Most importantly, she explained that patience mattered more than flames. The goal isn't to burn everything away. She picked up a weathered corn stalk. It's to leave something behind. She broke the stalk gently across her knee. The fire should transform it, not destroy it. The farmers listened carefully. Several filled pages of notebooks. Others simply watched every movement she made. Take a moment to like and subscribe to Farm Route Chronicles, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far this stories travel. The fictional story of Clara Whitmore reflects a very real shift that occurred in agriculture during the second half of the 20th century. Farmers, soil scientists, and conservationists increasingly recognized that productive farming depends not only on crops, fertilizers, and machinery, but also on maintaining healthy, living soils. Research into biochar, soil microorganisms, conservation tillage, cover crops, composting, and carbon-rich soils continues today. While no single practice works everywhere, the broader principle remains widely accepted. improving soil health often improves a farm's resilience over time. The ancient terra preta soils of the Amazon remain one of the world's most fascinating examples of long-term human stewardship of the land. They remind us that caring for the soil is not a new idea. It is one of humanity's oldest agricultural lessons. And perhaps the most enduring lesson of all is this: the greatest harvest any farmer leaves behind is not measured only in bushels. It is measured in the condition of the land entrusted to the next generation. Thank you for joining us on Farm Route Chronicles. If this story reminded you that the greatest treasures are often hidden beneath the surface, we'd love to have you with us for the next journey. Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and never underestimate what the land might be trying to teach. Because sometimes, the quietest fields tell the greatest stories. Don't forget to subscribe.